The encounter. The sun blazed high over the Riverview shopping center, casting long shadows on a sea of parked cars. It was the kind of bustling afternoon where people were focused on errands, small talk, and escaping the heat. Yet, amidst the hum of activity, tension rippled through the air as a police cruiser idled near the exit. Officer Brent Holton, a man infamous for his heavy-handed approach, sat in the driver's seat, scanning the crowd like a predator seeking its next target. Holton's gaze settled on a sleek silver sedan that glided into a parking spot near the entrance. The driver, a composed black woman dressed in a sharp navy suit, stepped out briefly to grab a bag from the trunk before slipping back into the driver's seat. Something about her confidence, her car, or perhaps simply her skin, lit a fuse in Holton's mind. Without a second thought, he turned on his lights and pulled up behind her, his presence looming. Inside the car, Lena James sighed as she noticed the flashing lights in her rearview mirror. She was no stranger to encounters like this. As a civil rights attorney, Lena had spent years defending those who couldn't defend themselves, confronting biases and abuses of power in courtrooms across the state. But today, it seemed, she was the target. Her stomach churned with a familiar frustration, but she steadied herself, preparing for what she knew was likely to be an uphill battle. The power play. Holton approached the driver's side window, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered weapon. His uniform clung to his broad frame, his expression hardened into one of authority mixed with suspicion. "Ma'am, roll down your window," he barked, his tone sharp. Lena complied, lowering the glass with a slow, deliberate motion. She turned to face him, her gaze steady and unreadable. "Good afternoon, officer. Is there a problem?" Holton didn't answer immediately. Instead, he surveyed her, his eyes flitting from her pressed blazer to the leather interior of the car. To him, this image didn't add up. A black woman driving a luxury car, exuding an air of confidence and calm. He didn't like it. "License and registration," he said curtly, ignoring her question. Lena retrieved her documents from the glove compartment, her movements measured and precise. As she handed them over, she asked again, her voice calm but firm, "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" Holton took the documents but didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced at her license. "Lena James," he read aloud, almost to himself. The name didn't mean anything to him, but something about her demeanor did. It irritated him. "Where are you headed today, Miss James?" he asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Lena arched an eyebrow, her patience thinning, but her resolve intact. "I'm returning home after a day of work, officer. And again, I'd like to know the reason for this stop." Holton's lips curled into a smirk. "Work, ah. What kind of work?" "I'm an attorney," Lena replied, her voice even. The weight of that single word lingered in the air like a challenge, but Holton refused to be swayed. "Oh, an attorney," he drawled mockingly. "And what firm do you work for, Miss Attorney?" Lena held his gaze, the corners of her lips curling into a faint smile. It wasn't amusement, it was a warning. "You'll find out soon enough," she replied, her voice carrying an edge of quiet power. Escalation. Holton's smirk faltered, his ego bruised by her unshaken confidence. He stepped back, signaling for her to get out of the car. "Step out of the vehicle, Mom," he ordered, his tone sharper now. "Am I under arrest, officer?" Lena asked, not moving. Her question was straightforward, but the undertone carried a challenge that made Holton hesitate for a fraction of a second. "I said step out of the car," he repeated, his voice rising. Lena's fingers gripped the steering wheel for a brief moment before she released it, taking a calming breath. She wasn't afraid. She was calculating. Slowly, she opened the door and stepped out, her heels clicking against the asphalt as she stood to her full height. Though not particularly tall, her posture and presence were enough to make Holton momentarily uneasy. "Hands on the hood," he commanded. "No," Lena said calmly, her refusal slicing through the air like a blade. The crowd of bystanders that had begun to gather murmured in surprise. "Excuse me," Holton said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Unless you have a legitimate reason to detain me, I will not comply with an unlawful order," Lena said, her voice steady. "Am I being charged with a crime, officer?" The tension between them was electric. Holton's jaw tightened, his hand twitching near his weapon. "You're obstructing justice," he snapped. "No, officer," Lena countered. "I'm exercising my rights, and I'd advise you to think very carefully about your next move, because any unwarranted contact will constitute a violation of those rights." The gathering crowd. By now, the scene had drawn a small crowd. Shoppers paused in their tracks, some pulling out their phones to record. Among them was a middle-aged mechanic named Joe, still in his grease-stained overalls. He stepped closer, his brows furrowed as he took in the unfolding situation. "Hey, what's going on here?" Joe called out. "Why's she being treated like this?" Holton ignored him, his focus locked on Lena. But the murmurs of the crowd grew louder, emboldened by Joe's question. "Is she even doing anything wrong?" A woman whispered. Another added, "She looks like she's handling herself better than that cop." Lena, hearing the growing support, felt a surge of strength. She took a step closer to Holton, her voice low but firm. "Officer, I'd advise you to consider the eyes on us right now. Cameras are rolling. And trust me, any action you take without cause will be held against you." Holton's face flushed red, anger warring with uncertainty. For the first time, doubt flickered in his mind. This wasn't going the way he had envisioned. The turning point. At that moment, a sleek black SUV pulled into the parking lot, its windows tinted. The vehicle parked a short distance away, and a tall man in a tailored suit stepped out. His presence immediately commanded attention. It was clear he wasn't just another bystander. "Lena," the man called out, his voice calm but firm. She turned toward him, her expression softening ever so slightly. The man approached, his sharp gaze sweeping over Holton and the crowd. "Is everything all right here?" Holton's brow furrowed as he assessed the newcomer. "Who are you?" he demanded. The man reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a badge and ID. "Samuel Carter, Deputy Director of the Department of Justice," he said, his tone carrying the weight of authority. He turned to Lena. "Lena James is my colleague. Is there an issue here?" Holton's face drained of color. The realization of who he was dealing with hit him like a freight train. His hand dropped from his holster, and he stepped back, stammering. I didn't know." "You didn't know," Lena interjected, her voice cutting through the air. "You didn't bother to know. That's the problem." The crowd takes a stand. The onlookers, emboldened by Samuel's arrival, began to voice their opinions more openly. "She didn't do anything wrong," one man shouted. "This officer needs to be held accountable," added another. Samuel raised a hand to quiet the crowd before turning to Holton. "Officer," he said, his voice calm but icy, "you've made a grave mistake. I suggest you take a moment to reflect on your actions because this isn't over." Holton nodded stiffly, his eyes darting between Lena and Samuel. The crowd murmured as Samuel placed a hand on Lena's shoulder, guiding her back to her car. As they drove away, Lena glanced in the rearview mirror, her mind racing. This was far from over. She wasn't just going to let it go. This was an opportunity to bring change, to challenge the very system that allowed officers like Holton to act with impunity. And she was ready for the fight. The aftermath of defiance. Lena James drove away from the parking lot in her silver sedan, her mind a storm of emotions. The encounter with Officer Holton was far from her first experience with racial profiling. But this time was different. This time, it wasn't just about her rights. It was about sending a message to those who thought they could act without accountability. Her career as a civil rights attorney had prepared her for moments like this, and she knew this wouldn't end with a simple apology or dismissal. As the black SUV carrying Samuel Carter followed close behind her, Lena's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "Samuel," Her mentor and colleague at the Department of Justice had always taught her the importance of measured responses, but the searing humiliation of the incident in front of onlookers weighed heavily on her. A call to action. Later that evening, Lena sat in her home office, surrounded by bookshelves lined with legal texts and awards from her years of work. Her laptop screen glowed softly in the dim room, showing a series of video clips from the parking lot confrontation. The crowd's recordings had already begun circulating on social media, and the hashtags #JusticeForLena and #RiverviewProfiling were trending. Each clip highlighted Officer Holton's aggressive stance, the tension in Lena's calm defiance, and the collective outrage of the onlookers. A sharp knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Samuel, his face carrying the same composed determination she had always admired. He placed a thick file on her desk and took a seat across from her. "We need to act, Lena," Samuel said, his voice low but firm. "This isn't just about what happened to you today. It's about what's been happening for years in Riverview and beyond." Lena nodded. Holton's behavior isn't an isolated incident. He's a symptom of a larger issue. But if we're going to challenge this, we need more than one encounter. Samuel tapped the file. "That's why I'm here. I've been gathering data on Officer Holton and others in the Riverview precinct. Complaints of excessive force, racial profiling, unwarranted searches. It's a pattern, Lena, and now we have a chance to expose it." She opened the file, her eyes scanning the reports. Each page detailed a story similar to her own. Different faces, different circumstances, but the same underlying prejudice and abuse of power. Lena's resolve hardened. The weight of the community. The next morning, Lena visited Riverview's Community Action Center, a modest building that served as a hub for local activism. She was greeted by Clara Thompson, a retired schoolteacher who had become a fierce advocate for civil rights in the town. Clara was already aware of Lena's encounter. The videos had reached nearly every corner of Riverview by now. "Lena, I'm so sorry you had to go through that," Clara said, pulling her into a warm embrace. "But you handled yourself with grace, and now people are paying attention." Lena smiled, appreciating Clara's support. "This isn't just about me, Clara. It's about everyone who's been treated like this and hasn't had the platform to fight back. We need to channel this momentum into real change." Clara nodded. "You've got the community's attention. Now, we need to keep it. Let's organize a town hall, give people a chance to share their stories, and hold the police accountable." Over the next few days, Lena and Clara worked tirelessly to organize the event. Flyers were distributed, social media posts went viral, and local leaders were invited to participate. The town hall quickly became the most anticipated event in Riverview, with residents eager to confront the systemic issues that had plagued their community. A divided precinct. While Lena rallied the community, Officer Holton found himself under scrutiny from all sides. The videos had not only reached the public, but also his superiors within the Riverview Police Department. Chief Marcus Bennett, a seasoned officer with a reputation for maintaining order, called Holton into his office. The atmosphere in the precinct was tense as Holton stepped inside. Chief Bennett sat behind his desk, his expression unreadable. A thick folder lay in front of him, its contents spilling out like an accusation. "Sit down, Holton," Bennett said, his voice calm but firm. Holton obeyed, his jaw clenched. "Chief, before you say anything." Bennett raised a hand to silence him. "I don't want to hear excuses. Do you have any idea what kind of firestorm you've caused? The department is being dragged through the mud because of your actions." Holton bristled. "She was being uncooperative. Chief, I was just doing my job." "Doing your job?" Bennett snapped, slamming the folder shut. "You escalated a situation that didn't require escalation, and now we're under investigation because of you." Holton's face paled. "Investigation?" "Yes," Bennett replied, his tone sharp. "The Department of Justice is involved, Holton. And if half of what they're saying is true, you won't just lose your badge. You'll face charges." Holton sat in stunned silence as the weight of Bennett's words sank in. For the first time, he began to grasp the gravity of his actions. The town hall. The evening of the town hall arrived, and Riverview's community center was packed to capacity. Residents from all walks of life filled the room, their faces a mix of anger, hope, and determination. At the front of the room, Lena stood alongside Clara, Samuel, and other community leaders. The event began with a moment of silence for those who had suffered injustices at the hands of law enforcement. Then, one by one, residents stepped forward to share their stories. A young black man recounted being pulled over 5 times in the span of a month for no reason. A Latina mother spoke tearfully about her son being detained without cause. An elderly white man revealed how he had witnessed Holton harassing a black teenager outside a convenience store. Each story added to the growing sense of outrage in the room, but it also fueled a collective determination to demand change. When it was Lena's turn to speak, the room fell silent. She took a deep breath, her voice steady as she recounted her encounter with Holton. But instead of focusing solely on her experience, she turned the spotlight on the systemic issues that had allowed it to happen. "This isn't about one bad cop," Lena said, her voice carrying across the room. "It's about a system that enables and protects people like him. And it's about us, the people of Riverview, demanding better for ourselves and our children." The room erupted into applause, the energy palpable. For the first time in years, the people of Riverview felt united in their fight for justice. The first steps. As the town hall came to a close, Samuel approached Lena, a faint smile on his face. "You've started something big here, Lena," he said, "but this is just the beginning." Lena nodded, her resolve unwavering. "I know, but I'm ready for whatever comes next." The days ahead would be challenging, but Lena was determined to see it through. With the community behind her and the weight of justice on her side, she knew this fight was far from over. The pressure mounts. The aftermath of the town hall rippled across Riverview like a shockwave, forcing people to confront the uncomfortable truths of their town. For some, it was a wake-up call. For others, a moment of reckoning. Videos from the event spread quickly across social media, gaining national attention and casting a spotlight on Officer Brent Holton and the Riverview Police Department. But for Lena James, it was only the beginning of what she knew would be a long uphill battle. A town divided. The town of Riverview was now sharply divided. On one side stood the community members rallying behind Lena, demanding accountability and systemic change. They were buoyed by the testimonies shared at the town hall and the growing media attention. On the other side were those who saw the movement as an attack on law enforcement, defending Officer Holton and accusing Lena of exaggerating her claims. Local news outlets jumped on the story, interviewing residents on both sides of the divide. Outside the police precinct, a small group of counter-protesters gathered, holding signs that read, "Support our cops," and "Justice, not witch hunts." Meanwhile, Lena's supporters organized marches, chanting slogans like "Justice for all" and "Accountability now." The tension was palpable. Friendships frayed, families argued, and Riverview's normally quiet streets buzzed with debates and confrontations. But amid the chaos, Lena stayed focused. Lena's determination. In her modest home office, Lena pored over documents late into the night. The file Samuel Carter had given her grew thicker each day, as more residents came forward with stories of harassment, profiling, and misconduct by Officer Holton and other members of the Riverview Police Department. Lena meticulously documented each account, cross-referencing them with public records and internal reports Samuel had managed to obtain. Her phone buzzed with constant notifications, messages of support, requests for interviews, and updates from her legal team. Despite the overwhelming workload, Lena felt a renewed sense of purpose. Every story she read, every person she spoke to, reminded her why she had chosen this path. One evening, as she reviewed a particularly damning report involving Holton's previous incidents, Samuel called. "Lena, we've got a problem," Samuel said, his tone grave. "What is it?" she asked, setting down her pen. "There's been an internal leak at the precinct. Someone's trying to discredit you. They're digging into your past, looking for anything they can use against you." Lena sighed but didn't falter. "Let them. They won't find anything." "Even so," Samuel continued, "we need to be prepared. This isn't just about Holton anymore. It's about preserving the system that protects him. They'll fight dirty. Then we'll fight smarter," Lena replied, her resolve unshaken. Holton struggles. While Lena prepared for the battle ahead, Officer Holton found himself increasingly isolated. The investigation into his actions had intensified, and the Department of Justice was now actively involved. Chief Marcus Bennett had placed him on administrative leave, pending the outcome of the investigation, and his fellow officers had grown distant. Sitting alone in his sparsely furnished apartment, Holton flipped through the local news channels, each one recounting the incident in the shopping center and the subsequent town hall. His name was everywhere, but not in the way he had always imagined. The public scrutiny was relentless. Protesters gathered outside his building, their chants audible even from his third-floor window. On social media, his face was plastered alongside hashtags like #JusticeForLena and #EndPaulicibias. For the first time in his career, Holton felt the weight of accountability, and it was crushing. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. After a few rings, Chief Bennett answered. "Chief, I need to talk," Holton said, his voice trained. "What is it, Holton?" Bennett replied, his tone curt. "I didn't mean for things to get this far. I was just doing my job." Bennett sighed. "If you were just doing your job, we wouldn't be in this mess. Look, Holton, the best thing you can do right now is cooperate with the investigation. If there's anything you haven't told us, now's the time." Holton hesitated but ultimately said nothing. The line went silent, and Bennett hung up, leaving Holton alone with his thoughts. The investigation heats up. Meanwhile, Samuel worked tirelessly behind the scenes to push the investigation forward. Using his connections at the Department of Justice, he secured access to internal precinct records that painted a damning picture of systemic issues within the Riverview Police Department. Complaints against Holton had been routinely dismissed or buried, and his superiors had turned a blind eye to his repeated misconduct. Samuel and Lena compiled the evidence into a comprehensive report, which they planned to present to the town council and the media. But they knew they needed more than just documents. They needed the voices of the community. Lena reached out to the individuals who had shared their stories at the town hall, asking if they would be willing to come forward publicly. To her surprise, nearly all of them agreed. They were tired of living in fear and silence. The tide was turning. A shocking revelation. As the investigation progressed, a startling revelation came to light. During a routine review of dashcam footage from Holton's cruiser, investigators discovered a recording from the day of Lena's traffic stop. The video showed Holton pulling her over, his demeanor aggressive from the start. But it also captured a conversation Holton had with another officer over the radio moments before the stop. "She's driving a luxury car," Holton had said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Bet she's got something to hide." The recording was damning, exposing Holton's bias in undeniable terms. When Lena and Samuel received the footage, they knew it was a game changer. "This isn't just about one bad officer," Samuel said as they watched the video. "This is about a culture that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked." Lena nodded, her jaw tight. "We need to make this public. People need to see the truth." Building momentum. With the video in hand, Lena and Samuel held a press conference outside the Community Action Center. Journalists from local and national outlets gathered, their cameras trained on Lena as she stepped up to the podium. "Today, we're here to share the truth," Lena began, her voice steady but powerful. "This is not an isolated incident. This is not about one officer. This is about a system that protects individuals like Brent Holton while disregarding the rights and dignity of the people they are sworn to serve." She played the dashcam footage for the crowd, the audio echoing across the square. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the audience as Holton's words played out in stark contrast to his claims of simply doing his job. "This is what we're fighting against," Lena continued. "But we won't stop until justice is served, not just for me, but for every person who has been targeted, harassed, and silenced." The crowd erupted into applause, the energy electric. Lena stepped back from the podium, her heart pounding. She knew the fight was far from over, but for the first time, she felt the full weight of the community's support behind her. The tipping point. The press conference marked a turning point in Riverview. Public opinion shifted dramatically, and even some of Holton's defenders began to question their stance. The town council announced an emergency meeting to address the growing crisis, and the Department of Justice expedited its investigation into the Riverview Police Department. For Lena, the battle was just beginning. But as she looked out at the faces of the people rallying around her, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about holding one officer accountable. It was about transforming an entire system. Confronting the system. As the town council announced an emergency meeting to address the rising crisis, Riverview was buzzing with anticipation. The parking lot of the town hall overflowed with cars, and people crowded the entrance, eager to get a seat inside. For many, this wasn't just a meeting. It was a pivotal moment for their town. Lena James, with her calm demeanor and unshakable resolve, was at the heart of it all. The air inside the chamber was thick with tension as council members, journalists, and residents packed the room. Lena and Samuel Carter sat at a long table near the front, their stacks of evidence meticulously organized. Across from them sat Police Chief Marcus Bennett, his expression one of measured caution, and a visibly shaken Officer Brent Holton, who had been summoned to testify. The atmosphere was electric. Everyone in the room knew this meeting had the potential to redefine Riverview's approach to justice or expose its unwillingness to change. Opening statements. Mayor Ellen Travers, a middle-aged woman with streaks of gray in her dark hair, called the meeting to order. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd, "we are here today to address the concerns raised by members of our community regarding systemic bias and misconduct within the Riverview Police Department. This is a serious matter, and we will hear from all sides before determining our next steps." Lena leaned forward, her heart pounding. She had prepared extensively for this moment, knowing that this wasn't just about confronting Officer Holton, but challenging an entire system that allowed such behavior to persist. The mayor continued, turning her attention to Lena. "Ms. James, you've been one of the most vocal advocates for change. The floor is yours." Lena stood, the room falling silent as all eyes turned to her. She began by recounting her own encounter with Holton, her voice steady, but filled with emotion. "What happened to me is not an isolated incident," she said. "It is a reflection of a system that has failed to hold its officers accountable, a system that prioritizes power over protection." She then presented the dashcam footage, the audio of Holton's biased comments echoing through the chamber. Gasps rippled through the audience, and Lena paused to let the weight of the evidence sink in. "This isn't about one bad officer," she continued, her gaze sweeping across the council members. "This is about a culture that enables such behavior. It's about every person who has been targeted, harassed, and silenced. And it's about whether Riverview is willing to confront these injustices or turn a blind eye." The room erupted into applause, the sound reverberating off the walls. Lena sat down, her hands trembling slightly as the magnitude of the moment hit her. Samuel gave her a reassuring nod, his expression one of quiet pride. Holton's testimony. Next, it was Holton's turn to speak. He stood awkwardly, his uniform slightly disheveled, and avoided making eye contact with the audience. His lawyer, a stern-faced man in a gray suit, stood beside him, whispering instructions. Holton began hesitantly. I want to start by saying I didn't mean for things to escalate the way they did," he said, his voice lacking conviction. "I was just doing my job." The crowd murmured in disapproval, but Mayor Travers quickly silenced them. "Officer Holton, please continue," she said. Holton cleared his throat, his hands gripping the edge of the podium. "I've served this community for over 10 years. I've made mistakes, sure, but I've always had the town's best interests at heart." Lena watched him carefully, noting the cracks in his composure. It was clear he was struggling to defend himself, and the evidence against him was too damning to ignore. His testimony ended with a weak apology, which did little to sway the room. Community testimonies. As the meeting continued, members of the community were invited to share their experiences. One by one, residents stepped forward, their voices filled with pain, anger, and determination. A young black man named Darius recounted being stopped by Holton multiple times for no apparent reason. "I'm not a criminal," he said, his voice breaking. "But that's how I'm treated every time I walk down the street." An elderly Latina woman named Rosa shared how her teenage grandson had been detained without cause. "He's a good boy," she said, tears streaming down her face. "But they made him feel like he was nothing." Each story added to the growing pile of evidence against Holton and the culture of the Riverview Police Department. Lena listened intently, her resolve deepening with every testimony. Chief Bennett's defense. As the testimonies concluded, Chief Bennett took the podium. His face was grave, his tone measured. "I want to start by saying that the Riverview Police Department takes these allegations very seriously," he began. "We are committed to serving and protecting all members of our community." But as he continued, it became clear he was trying to walk a fine line. "While Officer Holton's actions were inappropriate, I believe they do not represent the values of our department as a whole. We are reviewing our policies and will implement changes where necessary." The crowd wasn't satisfied. Murmurs of discontent filled the room, and Lena's jaw tightened. She knew Bennett's words were an attempt to deflect blame and protect the department's image. Lena's closing argument. When it was Lena's turn to speak again, she rose with renewed determination. "Chief Bennett," she said, her voice steady but piercing, "you say Officer Holton's actions don't represent the values of your department, but the evidence suggests otherwise. Complaints have been ignored, misconduct has been overlooked, and accountability has been absent." She turned to the council. "This isn't just about one officer. It's about a system that has failed the people it's supposed to serve. If you truly care about this community, you will take action, not just with words, but with meaningful reforms." The room erupted into applause once more, the energy palpable. Lena sat down, her chest heaving as the weight of her words settled over the room. The vote. As the meeting drew to a close, the council members deliberated. The tension in the room was unbearable, everyone holding their breath as they waited for the decision. Finally, Mayor Travers stood. "After much discussion, the council has voted to approve an independent investigation into the Riverview Police Department, as well as the implementation of mandatory bias training and the creation of a civilian oversight board." The room exploded in cheers and applause. Lena felt a wave of relief wash over her, though she knew this was just the beginning. The fight for justice was far from over, but tonight, they had taken a crucial step forward. The fallout. As the crowd dispersed, Lena stood outside the town hall, looking up at the night sky. Samuel joined her, a small smile on his face. "You did it, Lena," he said. "You made them listen." She shook her head. "We did it. This was a team effort." Across town, Holton sat in his apartment, staring at the TV as the news replayed clips from the meeting. His career was in tatters, and his future uncertain. For the first time, he began to question everything he had believed about himself and his role as a police officer. A new beginning. The events of that night marked a turning point for Riverview. The independent investigation brought more misconduct to light, leading to significant changes within the police department. Lena continued to fight for justice, her work inspiring others to stand up and speak out. But for Lena, the real victory was seeing the community come together. Residents of all backgrounds united in their pursuit of a fairer, more just town. And as she walked home that night, she felt a sense of hope she hadn't felt in years. The ripple effect. The independent investigation into the Riverview Police Department launched with immediate intensity. Federal agents arrived in town, armed with files, warrants, and a mandate to uncover the truth. For the first time in years, Riverview's police precinct was under the microscope, and it wasn't just Officer Brent Holton's actions in question. Investigators were digging into years of complaints, disciplinary records, and internal communications. Lena James, though exhausted from the town hall and months of advocacy, felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had lit the match, and now the fire was spreading. But she also knew the battle wasn't over. Change required persistence, and for every person supporting her, there were others resisting. Community support grows. In the days following the council's decision, Riverview underwent a transformation. The tension in the air didn't dissipate overnight, but there was a palpable shift in the community. More residents began attending public meetings, organizing rallies, and sharing their stories. Social media buzzed with hashtags like #JusticeForRiverview and #EndPolicivias. Lena became a symbol of resilience for many in the town. People approached her at the grocery store, at community events, and even on her walks through the neighborhood. Some wanted to thank her for standing up to the system. Others wanted advice on how to navigate their own battles with injustice. One evening, Clara Thompson, the retired schoolteacher who had been a key ally during the town hall, called Lena with exciting news. "Lena, you won't believe it," Clara said, her voice brimming with energy. "The high school students are organizing a march. They're calling it Hope for Riverview. It's all over social media." Lena smiled, feeling a swell of pride. "That's incredible, Clara. This is what we've been working for, getting people involved, making them believe they can make a difference." The march, scheduled for the following weekend, quickly gained momentum. Students designed signs and banners, local artists offered to paint murals celebrating unity, and small businesses donated food and supplies. Riverview was coming together in a way Lena had never seen before. Holton's isolation. While the community rallied around Lena, Officer Brent Holton found himself increasingly isolated. The investigation had uncovered troubling patterns in his behavior, including numerous complaints of excessive force and racial profiling. With each revelation, his reputation crumbled further. Holton's colleagues, many of whom had once admired his assertiveness, began distancing themselves. Even Chief Marcus Bennett, who had initially defended Holton, now avoided him. The precinct was under too much scrutiny to protect a liability. Sitting alone in his apartment, Holton scrolled through news articles and social media posts. His name was everywhere, but not in the way he had imagined. The once confident officer now found himself consumed by regret and fear. One evening, Holton's phone buzzed with a call from his lawyer. "Brent, we need to talk," the lawyer said. "The evidence against you is overwhelming. We need to consider a plea deal." Holton's stomach churned. "A plea deal? What does that mean for me?" "It means admitting wrongdoing and cooperating with the investigation. It's your best chance to avoid a harsher sentence," the lawyer explained. Holton felt the walls closing in. For the first time, he realized the full weight of his actions and the consequences they carried. The March for Hope. On a crisp Saturday morning, Riverview streets came alive with the sound of chanting and music. Hundreds of residents, young and old, gathered for the Hope for Riverview March. The crowd was a sea of colors, with banners reading "Unity over Division" and "Justice for All." Lena stood near the front, surrounded by Clara, Samuel Carter, and other community leaders. As she looked out at the diverse faces in the crowd, she felt a lump rise in her throat. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had ever faced injustice. Samuel handed her a megaphone. "This is your moment, Lena," he said. Lena stepped forward, her heart pounding as the crowd quieted. "Good morning, Riverview," she began, her voice amplified over the sea of people. "Today, we stand together, not just to demand change, but to celebrate the strength of this community. You've shown the world that when people unite, they can create something powerful." The crowd erupted into cheers, and the march began. As they walked through the town, residents came out of their homes to join in. Shopkeepers stepped outside to clap and cheer. Even those who had been skeptical of the movement couldn't deny the energy and hope radiating from the crowd. The investigation's findings. A few days after the march, the Department of Justice released its preliminary findings on the Riverview Police Department. The report confirmed what many had suspected: a pattern of racial bias, lack of accountability, and systemic failures in leadership. Holton was not the only officer implicated. Several others faced disciplinary action, and Chief Bennett was pressured to resign. The report also outlined recommendations for reform, including mandatory bias training, a civilian oversight board, and improved accountability measures. For Lena, it was a bittersweet victory. The findings validated her fight, but they also revealed just how deep the problems ran. Samuel called her the evening the report was released. "This is a huge step forward, Lena," he said. "But it's just the beginning. Implementing these changes will take time and vigilance." "I know," Lena replied, "but we've come this far. We can't stop now." Holton's decision. As the pressure mounted, Holton's lawyer arranged a meeting with the Department of Justice to discuss a plea deal. Holton knew his career was over, but he hoped to salvage what little dignity he had left. The meeting was tense. DOJ investigators laid out their evidence, detailing every instance of misconduct. Holton sat silently, his hands clenched into fists under the table. Finally, one of the investigators spoke. "Officer Holton, we're prepared to recommend leniency if you cooperate fully. That includes providing information about systemic issues within the Riverview Police Department." Holton hesitated, his pride warring with his survival instincts. After a long pause, he nodded. "I'll cooperate." Lena's reflection. That evening, Lena sat on her porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The fight for justice had consumed her life, but she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The investigation, the town hall, the march, it had all been worth it. Clara joined her, carrying 2 mugs of tea. "You've done something incredible, Lena," she said, handing her a mug. "You've shown this town what it means to stand up for what's right." Lena smiled, taking a sip of the warm tea. "I didn't do it alone. This community came together in a way I never imagined." As they sat in comfortable silence, Lena thought about the road ahead. The reforms were a step in the right direction, but she knew the fight wasn't over. Change was a marathon, not a sprint, and she was ready to keep running. A legacy of change. Months had passed since the town hall and the subsequent investigation, but the echoes of the movement Lena James had ignited still resonated across Riverview. The town was in a state of transformation. Messy, complicated, and necessary. Lena, ever determined, continued her work, now balancing her role as a civil rights attorney with her newfound position as a community leader. The reforms recommended by the Department of Justice were slowly being implemented. Bias training for the police department had started, overseen by an independent organization. The Civilian Oversight Board was established, with Lena unanimously elected as its first chair. The board had already begun reviewing cases of police misconduct, ensuring a new level of accountability. But despite these victories, Lena knew there was still much work to be done. Facing the resistance, not everyone in Riverview welcomed the changes. A vocal minority continued to criticize Lena and the movement she spearheaded. Anonymous letters found their way into her mailbox, filled with vitriol and threats. Some local businesses put up signs reading "Support our cops" as a subtle rebuke to the reforms. And while the majority of the town had rallied behind Lena, the divide remained evident. One afternoon, as Lena walked into a local diner to grab lunch, the murmur of conversations around her quieted. The room seemed to freeze as some patrons avoided her gaze, while others nodded in respect. The tension was palpable. Behind the counter, the diner's owner, an older man named Joe who had lived in Riverview his whole life, greeted her warmly. "Ms. James, it's good to see you." he said, his voice loud enough to cut through the silence. His open support was a quiet act of defiance against those who oppose her. Lena smiled. "Thanks, Joe. Just here for a sandwich." As she waited for her order, she noticed a group of men in a corner booth glaring at her. Their conversation was hushed but pointed. Lena stood tall, meeting their stares with quiet confidence. She knew their resistance wasn't about her personally. It was about the fear of change, of losing the power structures that had long gone unchallenged. Joe handed her the sandwich, giving her a firm nod. "You keep doing what you're doing," he said. "This town needed someone like you. A community transformed." The next major milestone came with the launch of Riverview's first-ever community policing initiative, a program designed to build trust between the police department and the residents they served. Lena had been instrumental in shaping the program, working closely with local leaders and law enforcement officials. The initiative's first event was a community cleanup day, where officers and residents worked side by side to beautify the town. It was a symbolic gesture, but Lena saw it as a crucial step toward healing the rift between the police and the community. On the morning of the event, Lena arrived at the park, where dozens of volunteers had already gathered. She spotted Chief Marcus Bennett, now visibly humbled after the scrutiny his department had faced, handing out trash bags and gloves. "Good morning, Ms. James," Bennett said, offering a tentative smile. "Good morning, Chief," Lena replied. Their relationship had shifted dramatically since the investigation began. While she still held him accountable for his past inaction, she also recognized his willingness to change. As the day went on, Lena noticed something remarkable. People who had once been on opposite sides of the issue were working together, sharing laughs and stories. A young black teenager joked with an officer while they painted a fence. An elderly white woman handed water bottles to a group of kids, including Darius, the young man who had shared his story at the town hall. For the first time, Riverview felt like a community again. Holton's final reckoning. While Riverview moved forward, Brent Holton's life had taken a stark turn. His cooperation with the Department of Justice had spared him the harshest consequences, but he was no longer a police officer. He had lost his badge, his reputation, and his standing in the community. Holton spent his days working as a security guard at a local warehouse, a far cry from his once proud position in the precinct. The humility of his new role forced him to confront the choices that had led him there. One evening, as he sat alone in his small apartment, he saw a news segment featuring Lena. She was speaking about the Community Policing Initiative, her voice calm and inspiring. For the first time, Holton felt something he hadn't expected: admiration. Despite everything, she had remained steadfast in her fight for justice. Holton decided to write Lena a letter. It was short and awkwardly worded, but it was sincere. He apologized for his actions and admitted that the investigation had opened his eyes to the harm he had caused. He didn't expect forgiveness. He simply wanted to acknowledge the truth. When Lena received the letter, she read it carefully. Her emotions conflicted. Part of her wanted to dismiss it, but another part saw it as a small but meaningful sign of progress. Change, she realized, wasn't just about reforming systems. It was about transforming hearts and minds. A day of celebration. A year after the town hall, Riverview held a celebration to mark the anniversary of the reforms. The event, held in the newly renovated community park, was a testament to the town's resilience and determination. Lena stood on a stage decorated with colorful banners, looking out at the crowd. Families picnicked on the grass. Children played near the fountain, and people of all backgrounds mingled. The town felt different, stronger, more united. Samuel Carter joined her on stage, handing her a microphone. "This is your moment, Lena," he said with a smile. Lena took the mic, her voice carrying across the park. "A year ago, we came together to demand change," she began. "We faced resistance, doubt, and fear, but we didn't back down. Today, we celebrate not just the progress we've made, but the spirit of this community, the courage to stand up, the strength to come together, and the hope for a better future." The crowd erupted into applause, and Lena felt a swell of pride. This was more than she had ever imagined, but it was exactly what Riverview needed. Looking ahead, as the sun set over Riverview, Lena sat on a park bench, watching the celebration wind down. Clara joined her, carrying 2 cups of lemonade. "You did it, Lena," Clara said, handing her a cup. "You changed this town." Lena shook her head. "We did it. This community came together in a way I never thought possible, and we're just getting started." As they sat in the fading light, Lena thought about the journey that had brought her here. The challenges had been immense, but the rewards were far greater. Riverview was no longer just a town. It was a symbol of what could happen when people stood together against injustice. And for Lena James, this was only the beginning.